Hi, welcome to another video tutorial on the web application NetChecklist.com. In this video, I'm going to talk about how to set up checklists in the application. So in this application, all of the tasks that are necessary to complete a process can be saved as a checklist. Now, the items on a checklist are not on the actual task list. A checklist is like a blank form that you can use over and over by making copies of it. And when a checklist is copied, the application adds all the items that are a part of that checklist to the task list. So the benefits of this are that your checklist can be continually improved over time, and then each time a checklist is used, all of the tasks from it are added to the task list automatically so that nothing gets forgotten and there's no typing required to get your tasks onto your task list. So here we are again, logged in as our fictitious user Bob Broker, working in his fictitious real estate organization called Ready Real Estate that Bob is an administrator of. If we click the checklist button up here on the main menu, we can see all of the checklists that belong to this organization over here in the right sidebar. And if we click one to select it, we're taken to a screen where we can edit this individual checklist. Once one's selected, notice that its button shows up slightly darker over here on the right. So there's sort of two different things that we're seeing here. There's the checklist itself, the name of it's up here, and we can edit it here. And then there are the individual items or tasks that belong to this checklist. Down here we see that this particular checklist has 9 tasks that belong to it, although a checklist can actually have any number of tasks. Each of the individual tasks that belong to a checklist have 3 links, one to edit the item, one to delete the item, and one to make the item dependent on another item. I'm going to cover task dependencies in another video, but they're really cool. It's worth checking out on the video. If we come back up to the top of the page and click the link to edit the checklist itself, then we are taken to the edit checklist page. Here we can change the name of the checklist. We can enter a checklist description, which is optional. We can check here whether or not a checklist is inactive. We can change or enter a checklist display order, and we can set a user assigned. Now the user assigned, the display order, and the description are all optional fields, so you don't have to enter those. Now, because the name of the checklist, which is here, has to fit in not only these buttons, but the drop-down menus in many places in the application, the length of the checklist name has to be limited to 40 characters. But if you need a longer place to give a description, that's what the checklist description is for. You can give a much longer description in that field. The inactive buttons here do exactly what you would think it would do. If a checklist is inactive, then it won't show up in this list over here, and it also won't show up in the drop-down menus throughout the application. The display order just controls the order in which the checklists show up both here and in the drop-down menus throughout the application. So it just allows you to display your checklists in whatever order makes sense to you. And it just simply puts them in ascending order, so it is okay to skip numbers. And I actually like to do that, so if I need to insert a new one later, it's easy to put it wherever I want to without having to go through and renumber the entire list. And finally, you can select a default user to assign the items to each time this checklist is copied. This is also an optional field, and I'll explain more about that in another video. Now, the last thing I want to point out on this page is down here at the bottom, where you actually may or may not see a button where you can delete this entire checklist along with all of the items that belong to it. This one does not have that button available, and if you read here the description, it tells you that you cannot delete it, and it tells you why. Basically, if any copies of it exist in the database, then you cannot delete an item. This works exactly like projects do. We talked about in the last video on projects. So if you can't delete a checklist because copies exist of it and you're done using it, you can simply make it inactive. That's exactly what that field is for. And finally, just like I talked about at the end of the projects video, if you don't have the ability to delete a checklist and you don't want to just make it inactive, what I don't recommend you doing is coming up here and changing the name of the checklist to a new checklist that you're going to create and then reusing it. There are some problems with doing that. That's also exactly like I talked about, having to do with projects. So if you don't know what I'm talking about, go back and rewatch the end of the video on managing projects. But the best option is just to make it inactive when you're done using it. That's why that field is there. Finally, whenever you make changes to anything on this page, you need to click this button to make changes to the checklist to save your changes. So let's just cancel out of this and let's go back to our main checklists page. And let's look a little more closely at the list of items that shows up here in the right sidebar. And notice that there's a setting here that asks whether or not to display inactive tasks. Right now it's set to no. If we change that to yes and update, then we see that we actually do have another checklist here which is inactive. If we click on that and go to edit it, we can see that it is inactive. So if you want to reactivate something, you can still go back and find it and reactivate it so it's not lost forever. But even though we've made this change here to display the inactive checklist, it still is not going to show up in the drop-down menus in the other parts of the application. So if you do want to start using a checklist again, you will need to reactivate it. So next, on these items on the right sidebar, notice that if we hover over an item, a little text box pops up, and what that is displaying is that display order along with the task checklist description. So here we're on this one. If we hover over it, we can see it's list item number 40, and it does not have a description, so that's why nothing's showing up there. And what that does is when you're on this page, it allows you to see what those settings are without having to edit a checklist and then come to this page and read it here. You can see it just by hovering over the item. If we want to create an entirely new checklist, we can do that in a couple of ways. First of all, we can come up here to the checklist button on the top, use the down arrow, and come down to create a new checklist, and we're brought to the create a new checklist page where we can enter these items. It's pretty much the same items that were on the other page, so I won't waste time going over them. Also, these items, menu items at the top of the sidebar, they vary from page to page, but on several of these pages having to do with checklists, we have an item to create a new checklist, so we can click that and also get to the same page. Now, if we want to add a new item to one of our checklists, a new task to one of the checklists, there's also a couple of different ways we can get to that. Again, we can come up here to the main menu button and come down to add a new item to a checklist, and we get that screen. Also, from this checklist page, we have a button also here, add a new item to a checklist. That gets us again to the same page. Once we get to the page, the first thing we have to select is the name of the checklist that we want to add this item to. If you wanted to add an item to a new checklist, then you would need to create the new checklist first so that you could select it from the box. And if you accidentally added an item to the wrong checklist, then that is super easy to fix. All you would have to do is go to the checklist where you did add the item, find that item and edit it, and when you got to the edit page, change it to the name of the checklist that you did mean to add it to, and save the change, and you'll be good to go. It'll be moved over to the correct checklist. Now, I want to show you that first, but before we go through the rest of the form, keep in mind the first thing when you're adding a new item to a checklist, you have to select is the name of the checklist you want to add it to. Let's go back to this page, and here you see this says add a new item to a checklist. If we're editing a checklist, if I select one to edit it, and I'm editing this checklist, now this button changes. It says add a new item to this checklist, and if I select it, the name of the checklist, the one we were already editing, is already selected for us. So the idea is just that if you're editing a checklist and you want to add an item to a checklist, then that's probably the checklist you want to add it to. But if it's not, that's okay. Just change it when you get here and save it, and again, you'll be good to go. So that's just a little slight time saver there. So moving down the page, you would next, in this field, type in the task name. That's the name of the task that you want someone to actually do, what it is they're supposed to actually do. And notice that as I'm going through this, take a minute and notice that all of this is 100% customizable. You can enter whatever you want for the checklist name as well as for each item that's on a checklist. So, I know I mentioned before that this is a completely generic application, but seeing now how you can set up your checklist, add items to the checklist, should really drive that point home. You really can use this application for anything you want to use it for. The application just provides the functionality. So next we select, when we're adding an item to a checklist, we select the user that we want to assign it to. And when we click the drop down, it shows here the users who are members of this organization. So anyone you make a member of your organization will show up in this list, and we can assign things to them. And if we do select a specific user, then that user will be assigned to that task every time that checklist is copied, every time that checklist is used. But if you need a little bit more flexibility, however, namely the ability to assign that task to a different member of your organization each time you make a copy of the checklist at the time you're copying it, then you can, on the checklist, select a user called assign user when copying checklist. And if you do that, then each time you copy the checklist, you'll select which member you want to actually assign these tasks to. I'll explain more of that in the video on copying checklists. Next, we can make a task or an item on a checklist inactive, which means that it won't be copied to the task list when the checklist is used. So you could use that for something you're thinking about adding to a checklist, or maybe you're thinking about deleting but you aren't totally sure yet and you don't want to forget about it. So that option is there. You can also make an item on a checklist urgent, which means that each time that checklist is copied, that item will be marked urgent on the actual task list. Next, again, you have a task description, which again can contain a large amount of text, so you can describe in as much detail as necessary how this task should be completed, or even why it should be completed. And of course, this can be used for training new employees, where you can give them a detailed description of exactly what they need to do in order to properly complete this task, and maybe even an explanation of why completing that task is important to the organization. Next, you can select a task class. I don't have any set up for this organization yet, but if you had them set up, they would show up here. And basically, they just give you another way to sort and filter your task list once the tasks are on your actual task list, not the checklist. And task classes can help you and your team members work more efficiently by focusing on one type of task at a time. I'll go into that in another video. Next, you can enter a task time, which is the time in minutes that it should normally take to complete that task. I'll cover that in another video. You can also enter a number of delay days, and for this task. The delay days will normally be 0, but basically it provides you a way to deliberately delay when the task will be assigned to whoever it's assigned to. And it could be used, for example, when a salesperson needs to follow up with a prospect a week or so after their initial contact. And in a case like that, the whole point is to wait a week before contacting that person again. So in a case like that, you could enter 7 for 7 delay days, and that task would not be assigned to that person for 7 days. It wouldn't show up on their task list until that 7th day arrives. But basically, if this is set to 0, then that task will be assigned immediately to whoever it's assigned to when the checklist is copied. I'll do another video on that as well. The last item on this is the list order, and that works just like the display order on here. It lets you control the order in which your tasks show up on the checklist. So I'll show you that in a second. But whenever you enter everything you want in here, you do have to hit this Add Item to Checklist button to save, to commit it to save all your changes. Let's go back to that checklist, and notice here's that list order, and they do, like I said, just show up in ascending order. So it is okay to skip items. Here I have not skipped any items. So if I wanted to add a new item to this checklist up here, I would have to go in and renumber the list. So That's not a very good option. So to keep from having to manually renumber a list, if you come back up here to edit this checklist and come down to the bottom, you probably saw this before, to renumber this checklist. Let's select that and confirm this is the one that we want to renumber. Actually, let me show you one thing before I do that. When we come down here, it hover over it, the box says that this will renumber all the items in this checklist in increments of 10. They will be kept in the same order they are currently in, and doing this spaces them out so you have room to add new items between them if necessary. We click that and there, and now we see these are numbered 10, 20, 30, 40, so we've got lots of space in here to work with. So that's how you set up checklists in this application. In the next video, we'll learn how to use our checklists by copying them to the task list.